Now we're going to talk about the model view controller design pattern, a famous design pattern implemented in many places, and this design pattern is used often in web applications, and in web applications you're going to see the separation of the various parts of the application into model view and controller parts. I'm going to discuss an overview now how that works, and I'll take a look at this schematically. I said this is an architecture design pattern. It gives you a method of architecture and of application architecture. For example, the user can interact with the view of the application. The view is typically the presentation part of the application, and the view is the part of the application that the user interacts with. So it could be, for example, a Java server page, a JSP page. It could be a PHP page if you're building your architecture in PHP. It could be a Ruby page if you're building your page in Ruby on Rails, and so forth. So typically, the user starts with a model view controller application by working with a view. This view could be a page full of HTML controls, for example, and the user enters their name and their preferences and so forth in the HTML controls, text fields, drop-down list boxes, and so forth in the view. This is the view part. The view then interacts with the controller. This is the application overseer. This is the controller of the application that coordinates what goes on. So the view sends data to the server. The view often will appear in the user's browser. The controller is back on the server. The server is where the action takes place in these applications, and the controller is back on the server. The controller gets the input from the user as entered into the view in the controller. And the controller makes the decision of how to work with that data, where to route it to. In particular, the controller can send data to the model. Now, the model is the data cruncher of the application. What happens is that this is a simplified version of model view controller, but the controller actually sees the data entered by the user needs to be crunched, needs to be processed. It will send that data to the model. Now, the model doesn't know anything about the fact that it's on a web server. It doesn't know where it is at all. As a matter of fact, it doesn't know that it's part of a web application. All it knows is that it sends data to process, to crunch. So you send data to the model. The model may apply, for example, business rules, or may apply tax rules and so forth, or check inventory and so on. So that's the model. So what happens is the user enters data into the view. The data goes to the controller. The controller decides how to route that data, and for example, it may send that data to the model. The model crunches that data, sends it back to the controller. The controller then can send that data back to the view. So you see, the view then will present that data, that crunch data, back to the user. So that's in essence how this model view controller design pattern works. Of course, it's a simplification. You can have many different ways of extending the design pattern, but fundamentally the user works with a view, which is the presentation of the data, usually in a web browser. The view sends that data onto the controller, which is on the server. Controller then will send data to the model to be crunched, and that's the data handling part. The model might also interface with the database, for example, database system, and the data is crunched in the model, sent back to the controller, and the controller will send it back to a view, may send it back to the same view or a different view that is the same web page or a different web page, and it may have different web page templates and so forth, and the view will appear then in the browser, and the user is able to see what's happened to their data and the results of sending the data to the controller. So the view and the controller and the model together make up the web application. This is found to be a good way to divide up web applications into the component parts. And those component parts are views. This simplified model, the simplified version here you see, just provides one view. There may be dozens of views depending on your web application. The view takes the data, sends it to the controller. The controller says, aha, this data needs to be crunched, sends it to the model, for example. The model sends it back to the controller. The controller sends it back to the view. It may be the same view, it may be a different view. That view then appears in the browser and the user can see it. So for example, you might want to check on the availability of some item in stock. The user decides on that item, selects that item in the view sends it to the controller sends it to the model interfaces to a database system. You determine whether or not the item is in stock, say that it is. That information is sent back to the controller, and that information is then sent back to the view, which says that the item is in stock, and the user sees that result in the web browser. So this is a way of dividing up your code implementation into various sections. It's found to be a good way of doing things because the view can handle all the presentation details. The controller can be the overseer of the entire application. The model can actually do the data crunching without knowing anything about being on a web server. So that's the model view controller model. That's the model view controller architecture, and that shows you how, in essence, it works. It's a good way of dividing up web applications into these three parts: the model, which is the data cruncher; the controller, which is the overseer of the application and routes your data; and the view. And actually, web applications typically have more than one view object, and the view is the presentation part of your code which interacts with the user. It's usually good to avoid mixing the presentation part of your code with the data crunching part of your code, for example. And that's partially what's behind this model view controller architecture. So that's the model view controller architecture. That's the model view controller design pattern in essence, in overview, and it can get much more elaborate, but now you know at least what the parts of this architecture does: model, and the controller, and the view, and that's how this design pattern recommends that you divide up the parts of your web application into, because the presentation is going to be filled with HTML code. The model is going to just concern itself with data crunching, and the controller is the application overseer, which handles routing of your data primarily to the correct model and to the correct view.